Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. I'm Mark Glaser, Executive Editor of PBS MediaShift. This week we'll be talking about the new big State of the News Media report from Pew Research Center, which looks at pretty much every sector of the news business, from TV news to radio to online to mobile. And their findings around digital, as we know, a lot of things have been moving to digital, a lot of the money, ad money, but also a lot of digital native publications that have been getting funding, BuzzFeed, Upworthy, and others. And Pew's State of the News Media really looks deeply into digital trends, such as all these digital native companies getting funding, and also the move of money into mobile advertising and paywalls, helping prop up some of the legacy media organizations. So we'll dig deeper into the State of the News Media report. Before we start, I want to introduce our esteemed panel. We have Adrienne LaFrance joining us, freelance writer who wrote a great piece for Quartz about VC funding going into news sites. We have Amy Mitchell from Pew Research Center, who helped shepherd this large report for the Pew Center. We have Claire Grodin, our MediaShift intern. Once again, we have Elise from NPR News, and Monica Guzman from Seattle Times and Geekwire joining us after a brief respite. So let's talk about this report. Amy, I know this has been something you've been working on for a while. You've been talking a lot about it, and on our show we're obviously most interested in the digital part of it. And each year the report talks about, you know, kind of the decline of a lot of legacy media. And this year I think you guys really looked a little bit deeper into what's happening in the digital, not just, you know, digital dimes aren't going to replace the print dollars that are disappearing, but also these kind of new, more upstart sites. I mean, some of them aren't even really that new, Huffington Post and others. But in the last few years, it seems like there's been an acceleration among kind of venture funding into these companies, and we also have philanthropists, people like Pierre Omidyar, starting First Look Media with $250 million. So a lot of money is going into digital news. Talk about a little bit about what you guys found in looking at this kind of moved with money into digital.
Well, there really has been quite a deal of movement and activity and growth in digital native sites over the last year in particular. And it's hard, if you're anybody, you know, if you follow this industry at all, it was hard to not sort of feel that pulse and the energy that was behind some of this growth. Not just, so it's a combination of folks that are inside technology that are, you know, starting content organizations, whether it's BuzzFeed or Mashable, that have this almost innate understanding of technology, know how to work in that space, bringing some new money into that, but then marrying that technology expertise with some pretty big name journalists. And some of this, you know, growth over the last year began with Nate Silver's movement over to ESPN, and then we had, you know, all the way through to Ezra Klein and others. And so one of the things that we looked at were these larger, more well-known kind of national and international entities, and then also at the local level. And we identified close to 500, most of which are the smaller kinds of outlets that are popping up, and we're able to tally up about 5,000 jobs that have been created around editorial and staffing for original news content.
And while that's 5,000 jobs, it's pretty impressive. I guess it's just a drop in the bucket when you think about all the journalists that have lost their jobs over the last few years, right, and legacy organizations.
Yeah, so if you look at the newspaper industry alone, they have lost over 16,000 jobs since 2003. So they've actually lost, you know, almost triple the number that have been created in this digital space, according to what we could tally up. And they still have roughly 38,000 full-time editorial employees. So it is a small number, and one question that, you know, still needs to be examined is how, you know, to what degree is this something that can be transferable and applied in terms of the energy and this combination of technology, knowledge, and journalism to a broader swath of the news that consumers are getting.
So I'm curious, Amy.
Go ahead, Monica, jump
in. How in the count of 468, how far down the local spectrum does that get? Does that include hyperlocal sites in neighborhoods around the country? Is it every possible news site you could get your hands on?
It's whatever, yeah, we actually use 5 different listings, sort of catalogings of small local sites, including the hyperlocal. So we've got everything from Jan Schaefer's list to Michelle McClellan's list to a number of other local outlet lists. And then we have done a bunch of research ourselves over the last year where we were focusing on nonprofit news outlets in particular, most of which most of these are nonprofit. So, certainly there are plenty that are out there that I'm sure we were not able to find, but we really did do due diligence in trying to track them down. And, they did need to be doing original reporting. That was one of the qualifications.
Okay, good to know.
And Amy, another question for you. We want to learn so much from you today, Amy, but of these news organizations, how many, is there a sense that the large swath of them have figured out the big revenue question? Because it seems to me that even for big name outfits, big name new outfits like Ezra Klein's or Nate Silver's, these VCs are making a bet, but a bet based on what sort of promise?
Well, yeah, that's a terrific question, and the ironic answer is no, they really don't. They really haven't figured out a revenue system or a revenue model. Most of the money that's supporting these is, if you look at the big 30 that we looked at, most of it's coming from outside of the news operation. So it's either venture capitalists, it's wealthy individuals with deep pockets. At the smaller levels, there's a lot of nonprofit foundations that have gotten into the mix, and philanthropy, and in some cases, like places like BuzzFeed, that are using revenue from other parts of their organization to get their news operation off the ground. But no, the short answer is that the big question around what's the sustainable financial model for news in the future, for news of the digital era, that's still a big question.
And Adrienne, I know you had an interesting story talking to a lot of VCs, some of which have really put their money where their mouth is on kind of the future of news, putting a lot of money in, like Eric Hippo at Lara Ventures, and then some are a little skeptical about content and journalism online. I know it's always been a little bit of a dirty word among VCs to really fund journalism or fund content generating companies, but do you think that's changing now with all the money going into a lot of these content organizations?
I think it really will depend on the investor. So I've talked to some investors who very much value original journalism and all of the time it takes and all of the original content that it produces. At the same time, I talk to VCs who also are still looking at content as something that's not worth the money, and like, why pay a journalist for it if someone who's not a journalist can create it for free? Obviously, that's not a popular attitude amongst journalists, or many journalists, I should say. But so I think it's really split. And the interesting thing is that you're seeing some VCs now who are at least willing to invest in content, and for a lot of people, I think that's what looks like a bright side, even if the long-term sustainable business model isn't worked out. So yeah, that's probably where we are there, I think.
Yeah, because Mark Andreessen wrote a really interesting piece saying he saw, the potential for the news business to be 10 times bigger, and he's put a lot of money into a lot of these kind of digital native organizations like Business Insider and others. Does his kind of leadership mean something in the VC community, or will there always be kind of skeptics who aren't going to believe that there's something there?
Well, I think the other thing to consider when we talk about news as a growth business is that the kind of growth we're seeing is still not growth to the business that we know that once worked. So like the print ad-based business is not a thing and is not going to be a thing going forward. And so the people who are optimistic, I think, are willing to look at the growing news business as something that's growing into something we don't totally recognize yet. Are there going to be components of it that are still amazing and based on some of the traditions in great journalism? Of course. But I think the people who are most optimistic are probably also the people who are most open-minded about what the future of journalism is going to look like.
Yeah, and with BuzzFeed's a good example. They have a lot of venture money. They get tens of millions of people visiting their sites. They're great at social, and they're even starting an investigative unit. But Amy, you found that a lot of these kind of digital native publications still aren't bringing in. When you look at the whole of all publications and news and all the different sectors, this is still a very, very tiny slice of revenue. And I'm curious also about the native ad part. You know, we talk a lot about that, and BuzzFeed really depends on this kind of native ads. Did you look at how that fits into kind of the digital mix in your report?
Well, you know, overall, the money that we're able to account for among these digital is only about 1% of the total revenue that's coming into the news industry, which we have estimated to be a little over $60 billion. So it is a small sliver. It's got some energy behind it. It's got some technology know-how, but it's small. 69% is still coming from advertising, most of which, as Adrienne said, is tied to a dying brand of advertising. You know, print advertising continues to plummet. So there's a real question here about the future. But I think Adrienne makes another important point about how news is functioning differently in the digital space and in the digital spaces. So it's not like there's just one digital space. You've got your social media areas, you've got your web Google Hangouts, you've got your mobile devices, so that news is going to function and flow differently in each of those spaces a little bit, and your relationship with audience and the way news fits in with all that other content is varied as well. But one of the things that we have seen consistently in these new areas is that news finds a place. People end up getting news over the course of their activities, wherever it is they're spending their digital time. And so as a venture capitalist, as somebody who's developing, news ends up being a part of what's in the mix there.
Monica, do you have any other thoughts about the way this breaks down as far as, you know, kind of this rise of digital, but it's still kind of small, even though there's a lot of potential, and VC people see some potential, and obviously billionaires have been putting some money into it. You know, there's obviously different reasons people are getting into news and investing in news. Some really believe in the business. Others maybe see it as just a megaphone or a way to get their point of view across.
Yeah, I mean, my concern, and having been on this podcast a while, you probably could guess, is I'm always thinking about local. I'm always thinking about how news, you know, it's meant to serve communities of all sizes. And digital is still very much being talked about on the national scale. What are these sites that are national, that have figured out SEO, that have figured out how to share really widely, and are attracting the kinds of investors that wouldn't be very interested in more local efforts. So I'm very curious to see, when are we going to start to see more sustainable models, or the effect, whatever comes after this sort of digital renaissance on the national scale. I'm kind of waiting to see when it gets to the local level and you start to see models that get replicated in other communities. I'm going to feel a lot better about where we are. And it feels like so far we're still mostly talking about studying, etc., the national big sites. So yeah, I mean, when you talk about investors, when you talk about the tech community, they're not really interested in the little things. And that's a problem when it comes to news, because news is ideally for everybody, including people who are not, you know, necessarily interested in national coverage but want something more local. And that's where the newspaper jobs have been leaving the most gaps.
And just to send in a little optimism, I mean, I feel like local news nonprofits have done some of that work, right? Some of the best and most robust news nonprofit startups that we've seen since 2009 and even before that have focused on specific regions or specific communities. But as Amy mentioned from the very beginning, only a small handful of them have figured out the revenue pie, and maybe that happens. And we at the Texas Tribune, where I worked previously, we saw tremendous success with events and bringing in and leveraging our communities. And so I'd love to see more movement and experimentation in that realm.
I'd also point out that before Pierre Omidyar founded First Look, he actually founded Honolulu Civil Beat, where I work. Right. Full disclosure, I was a City Hall reporter there. And there, it's a great example of a totally digitally oriented local news site that's completely focused on the local news community, and in a place that really, really needs local coverage and lacks it because of their pretty terrible daily newspaper.
How did that go there? I'm curious, because we've talked about Civil Beat a little bit in the past, and I know they tried kind of a paywall model. I mean, did they really have to kind of change the way they were looking at things? I mean, did they have to experiment with different ways to make it sustainable?
Absolutely. So, I mean, and again, full disclosure, I work there. I still contribute there. So I'm very much Team Civil Beat. They started with a hard paywall, which very quickly became apparent was not the best approach, and went to a metered paywall, which is what they still use. But I mean, speaking of like the Texas Tribune events model. Civil Beat does like news cafes and has tried to do a lot with like Skyping in with various community leaders and a real digital approach to local issues, which I think, I mean, I would love to see other communities do that same kind of thing for sure.
So can I ask, Adrienne, does the Civil Beat, do they do content sharing with any other sort of local news outlets? Because that's one of the areas that we've seen have some development and potentially promise in terms of at least being able to stay above water.
Yeah, so I know when I was there, I'm not sure about whether these partnerships are still up to date, but when I was there was a partnership with Hawaii Public Radio as well as with the local KTV, the local ABC TV affiliate. They also have some sort of deal with ProPublica, so they can publish really great ProPublica articles, which is good for the Civil Beat brand. And there may be other partnerships at this point. I mean, they started HuffPo Hawaii as well, so that's another area where Civil Beat can get revenue without putting ads on the Civil Beat site, but they have that tie-in to HuffPo Hawaii, and which is a different approach, obviously.
And Civil Beat also had a lot of video. I know that they had reporters doing a lot of video reports. They really focused on video. And that's something, Amy, you looked at in your report, was kind of this rise of a lot of video reports and video journalism. But there's still, I guess, questions, even though more and more people are doing video reports, there's still questions as to how sustainable that is, because creating video is kind of a pain. There's a lot of editing that goes into it, and there's a lot of cost behind creating video. You want to do something really well produced.
Yeah, so you have, I mean, it's about a third of U.S. adults that watch online news videos. It's about half of those that watch any online videos. And news is, again, a part of the mix. It's about in the middle in terms of the different topics and things people are watching videos about. But when it comes to revenue, yeah, it's certainly not a sure win. Digital, online digital video advertising has grown substantially, but the total dollar amount is still really small, and it accounts for only about 10% of all online advertising, and only about 2% of all advertising. And in that mix already are some of the really big players like Google through YouTube, and now Facebook is just moving into that market. So how much revenue news organizations will be able to expend from that kind of content is a question, and as you say, it's costly and complicated in many cases to produce. But one of the other things, so if we think about this from the local level, there are two other things. I mean, online video with mobile devices has really offered an opportunity for consumers to be more a part of the process, to be a contributor to news in new ways, to be offering eyewitness video accounts, to be submitting their own, to posting them on social networks. And we see 7% of the population that's doing these things at this point in time. Local television, one question that we put out there for local TV is, to what degree are local televisions starting to put their content on the web in digital form? And many are, but they're often just streaming their newscast as opposed to doing original kind of video work.
And you know what I found about that, and I just want to stop on this local TV point really briefly, Amy, just because I come from local TV. That's where I spent a decade of my career, and I have always been really frustrated by the format not changing at all for like 30 to 40 years. And it seems like, and I after reading the report more closely today, I realized why. I mean, there's only like something in the single digits, and it's maybe even less than 5% of their revenue comes from digital, right? So there's very little business incentive to change, right? To do anything different. And so, and we know, of course, that newspapers only evolved when their backs were up against the wall, and I hate to see that, because I'm guessing something's going to have to give with local television news in the coming years, even though your report shows that their decline has sort of evened out, and if not grown in some areas. Is that right, Amy?
Yeah, their audience is actually up this year for the first time in 5 years, so we'll see if that's something that ends up being kind of a consistent trend or if it's just an anomaly. But as you say, the big challenge is that so much of their revenue is coming from their legacy product, and that's exactly what we saw the newspaper business go through. And so it's very hard to tear away from that advertising money, which is very strong in local television. It still remains very strong. They had more political advertising as an industry in 2012 than ever before. So and retransmissions fees are on the rise, and we've seen huge numbers of transactions as large companies want to amass more and more stations for leverage. So that legacy product is still very dominant in terms of the revenue structure and the financial structure.
And I'm just worried that that's, you know, the consequence of that is failure to evolve or sort of innovate within their own editorial formats.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, you know, what people tend to go to local TV for, what they've told us in the past, the main things they go to local TV for is weather and breaking news.
Right.
There are other places you can go online for some of that information. And so if local TV doesn't transition in a successful way, they may, you know, potentially lose that audience.
You also saw, I saw that you also had a rise a little bit in the evening news format too, like the national evening news, which I was kind of surprised about because that seems like it's just been a slow decline. But you think that's a blip as well, or do you think there might be something there?
You know, some people say, well, you know, it was a really big weather year and a certain number of international stories, so that could have brought people back. But the good old evening news had about a 2% bump up for this past year. So again, we'll continue to look at that and see what it suggests in the long term.
You talked a little bit about mobile, and I'm curious about kind of the opportunity there because we've talked so much about mobile coming on and that advertising is finally starting to hit there. But it doesn't seem like the news organizations are the ones kind of gaining when it comes to mobile. That also seems like something where Google and Twitter and Facebook seem to be the ones who really understand how to monetize mobile, and a lot of the big news organizations haven't really figured out a way to kind of make money from it.
Well, it's very challenging, and in many cases, so if you're going to go the app route in mobile, you've got to go through your app provider, right? Through your Google or through your Apple, give them a chunk of the money, give them a chunk of that revenue, whatever small piece you get, and then work within the bounds of their programming and create a new mobile version for each of the different devices that you're going to try to be able to be present on. So you've got to have a different app for your Apple than you do for your Android, than you do for your Blackberries and your others. And some are just opting to mobile optimize their browser and stay with the browser app now that HTML5 is there. So it's hard to account for, it's hard to track the audience, and if you're going to go into that space in an app mode, you already are ceding over some control and revenue to the programmer and the tech companies.
And you've seen, I guess, that people actually prefer, on their mobile devices, they actually prefer going to using a web browser to look at those news sites rather than using the apps. There's still a pretty wide preference for just basically using a browser and not even using apps.
And that's consistent.
Oh, go ahead.
I just was going to say kind of the broader picture is that's consistent with all, you know, tech trends generally. If you listen to Mark Zuckerberg talk, they're moving away from just native, or I guess specifically designing Facebook for apps, but for making sure that their browser experience is responsive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you think about it. I mean, people are more accustomed to going to a browser, and so for a good portion of the population, it's just what they're naturally going to do. Sort of getting, you know, going to an app store, downloading it. It's more of a process to learn than just going to the browser. And for countries outside the U.S., where they were, you know, a little bit behind in terms of the technology developments, many of them started with HTML5, never even developed an app, and so it's sort of very foreign to them. You know, well, why wouldn't you just do HTML5? Because it's a much better experience than the older browser versions.
Fair enough. Were there any big surprises in all your reports? I know obviously you brought up a lot of things, and you guys look at things throughout the year. But was there something that really stuck out to you, especially on kind of the digital side, that maybe you weren't expecting?
Well, it was really illuminative to have pulled together all the data on these new digital natives. Not all new, but these digital natives. You know, many at the local level and also those that are at the national level, and be able to put them in perspective in terms of the industry as a whole. I think that, you know, coming up with that number, the 1% of the revenue, 5,000 jobs versus all these others, for all that momentum, it really is important to keep in mind how much of the news ecosystem they're representing, and what consumers are receiving.
Adrienne, did you have any final thoughts about just where kind of the news business is going, not only in your own reporting, but what you saw in the Pew report?
I mean, the thing that always strikes me about the Pew report, which I look forward to every year, is that it always feels like more of the same. And I mean that we know the direction we're going in. We're going digital, we're going mobile, and it always feels like the news industry is really slow to get there, even when we know this. And so I guess I'm just, it leaves me continuing to wonder how much time we have to figure out where we're going before this huge population of journalists and news organizations really can no longer make ends meet, because that, to me, seems to be the direction we're going.
Definitely. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate everyone for joining us. It was a really good discussion. And agreed that the State of the News Media Report is great. It's something we look forward to, and I'm sure we'll all be spending our weekends reading it, over coffee, etc. So thanks a lot. I want to thank our panel again, Adrienne LaFrance joining us, Amy Mitchell from Pew Research Center, Claire Groden, our Mediatwits intern, Elise Hu from NPR, Monica Guzman from Seattle Times and Geekwire. And we'll catch you each and every Friday on the Mediatwits at PBS MediaShift at pbs.org/MediaShift. If you're listening to us through iTunes or Stitcher, be sure to rate us there and give us feedback. So we'll catch you next week. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody.